In this video, we're going to talk about conferencing and peer reviews, which are ways to provide students with feedback on a paper. One of the things we do know is true about writing is that feedback is a far more effective teaching strategy than simply having a student turn in a paper and then put comments on it and then return it to the student. Often students don't read these comments, they don't understand them, they're not exactly sure how to make the improvements that you're asking for. So opportunities for students to have a reader who then responds to their paper can be more effective for them to think about how to manage this writing situation and this writing project and then move forward with it. So conferencing and peer reviewing are two different ways to do this and worthy of consideration from any writing teacher. So conferencing is one-on-one interaction with a student, usually in the drafting stage of writing, but it could be in the planning or the revision stage as well, where the instructor meets with and talks to the student about the draft and how it can be developed or improved. It can be time-consuming for the teacher, but we'll talk about that in a minute, strategies to deal with this so it doesn't consume too much of your time. One of the things that I've found in conferencing is I never feel like I've really begun to develop a good rapport with students until I've spent that one-on-one time with them talking about their paper. I spend time with them in each stage, in the planning stage, drafting, and revision stages, and get to talk to them about their ideas and how to develop it. And that opportunity really does change my rapport in the classroom, I feel like. And it's the way that I really kind of get to know students and know what their specific issues is. And so conferencing allows us also to deal with specific issues that each individual student might have. So some students may have fabulous ideas, but they have some challenges with their grammar and presentation. Other students may have really solid grammar, but they don't develop their ideas well. And so you can work individually with each student to meet those individual needs. Some of the best practices for holding conferences is to have students bring in maybe 2 printed copies of the paper, so the instructor can have one and the student can have one, or it may involve bringing a laptop and then sitting side by side so that you both can look at the laptop. But the student should have a pen in his or her hand. This is not an opportunity for the instructor to do all of the work. So it really should be a dialogue, not a monologue. Not the instructor saying, here's what you need to change to make this paper good, but an opportunity for the student to take notes, to make annotations, to make their own corrections in the draft. And sometimes you may have to tell a student, okay, that's a great idea, write that down. Or, okay, if you want to change that, let's go ahead and see how we might change that sentence. Because often students, I think, are a little uncomfortable with the silence of the instructor sitting there quietly while they're writing something down. And so they may need to be encouraged that that is okay, and then we have to be patient while they do it. We also don't want it to be a silent experience where the instructor is reading the paper while the students is there, scrolling on their phone or whatever. It needs to be always a two-way interaction between teacher and student. So some suggestions for how to manage conferences. Have students read aloud, read their own paper aloud, or read their paper to them. I always have students read their papers aloud. And what I've found is a lot of times students are able to identify their own problems. They start to see, they'll be reading along and they'll say, that sentence doesn't make any sense. Okay, so let's consider how we might fix it. Well, I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to write it. So what are you trying to say there? Just put it in your own words. And then as they talk, I'll write down what they're saying. See, you didn't know what to say. Let's just say it like that. And if we need to clean it up a little bit, we can do that. But that's a much clearer statement of what you wanted to say. So if I start to see error patterns in grammar, I can stop and draw their attention to that. Sometimes it means teaching them subject-verb agreement and then stopping them the next 2 or 3 times that it occurs until they begin to see it themselves. But that reading aloud keeps it interactive. It gets them, a lot of students have not proofread their own papers carefully. And so it helps them to recognize that this is a strategy that they can always use in every assignment in order to improve their writing. I might ask them, how does this connect? How does this point connect to your thesis? And they can tell me how it does, but you didn't say that in the paper. So let's think about how to make that connection clear for your reader, because your reader is not in your head. I often say to students, you know exactly what you're trying to say, but all I know is what's on the page. And so you got to fill in those gaps. So let's figure out how to fill in those gaps. So we also want to look not just for grammatical issues, but for macro issues, issues in development, in organization, in unity, in voice or style or clarity. So we want to look at macro issues along with the micro issues, which would be grammar and mechanical issues. And you can use the conferences, you should use the conferences to reinforce your goals for the paper and for the class. This is not really it should not just be an editing process. It really should be a development and revision experience as well, depending on the needs of the student, of course. Conferences can be time consuming, and so some strategies for doing that. There are some professors who set aside a week of class and have one-on-one appointments all day long for 5 days, where they spend about 15 minutes with each student. That is an option. It's a really useful option, but it will consume your whole entire week. So another option is to set aside class days that are work days where students can be working on their paper. And you can move through the room from one student to another, have the rest of the class working while you're talking around individually with students. If you have the advantage of a quiet area, an office, or a common space outside of the classroom, you can have students come one-on-one. You might decide to have individual conferences only with students who have a particular need for them. You might decide to do conferences as a revision strategy after you have read and responded to all of the papers. The ones that really need extra help, you meet with them. But probably it's not useful to have the students send the papers ahead of time. You give them feedback, send it back to them, and consider that a conference, because all that does is fix the paper that they produced. It doesn't help them improve themselves as a writer, and that's our goal. I mean, that's the goal of a freshman composition class, is to help students become better writers, not to create one single better paper. Another option for offering feedback is peer reviews, and peer reviews are a way for students to respond to one another's writing. So they have a student reader give them feedback. It is, some of the advantages are that students get feedback from another reader besides just the teacher, and each student, as they read a partner's paper, they see how another writer has tackled that same assignment. And for especially more advanced writers, that can be really useful for them to see other models, gets them to think in different ways. It helps, reading another student's paper helps them improve their own paper. So those are some of the advantages. The disadvantages are, it's often really difficult for students to know how to give feedback. They might feel uncomfortable giving a negative critique of a student's work. They might give an overly negative critique and not be affirming enough and discourage the partner student. The confident writers, usually can offer some really good feedback, but insecure writers often feel ill-equipped to be providing a critique of another student's paper. And sometimes if you offer guidelines or some kind of structure or framework for giving feedback, students will just answer those questions as though they were completing a worksheet without much thought or energy in it. Peer reviewing is a pretty loaded issue. Some writing teachers swear by it and think it is absolutely essential. Other writing teachers avoid it like the plague. So ways to make it effective, sort of, is to make sure that it's well planned and well organized, give students some guidelines, maybe a peer review worksheet for things to look for, provide open-ended questions, not was the introduction good, because then they'll write yes or no. What did you like about the introduction? Why did the introduction make you want to read further? Questions like what was the strongest part of your partner's paper? Where could your partner improve the paper? What is the thesis? Restate the thesis in your own words. Those kinds of things. Were there any passages that you found confusing, or mark any passages that you found confusing? But it needs to be well considered. It's valuable to practice with peer reviewing. I don't know that I would discount it out of hand, but keep your expectations reasonable for the peer reviewing process. It probably should not take the place of individual time with the professor. You might consider giving peer reviews a grade. It's not something that I have ever done, but I know other writing instructors who do that. It may be a completion grade, or it may be an evaluative grade. And you might also consider anonymous peer reviewing. A lot of the learning management systems will allow you to create a peer review, and then it will automatically assign the paper to another classmate, and that may allow for better critiques. It may allow for harsher critiques. So a conversation about good manners, how to be encouraging, how to be polite would be useful in the peer reviewing process. So looking for ways to provide feedback before the draft is turned in, so that students aren't just generating a draft and then getting a grade with comments that are essentially often just to justify the grade that they got, can be a more effective way of helping them to develop as writers than simply making them tackle the project entirely on their own. Now, this should obviously not be the instructor telling them how to do it or what to say, but the instructor working together with the student like a coach.